I work, or I guess now worked, at a radio station, and I think we made contact with something. I don't really know anymore. Here, let me start from the beginning. About a year ago now, I got an internship at a radio station. It's always been a dream of mine to be in broadcast, and while my end-game goal wasn't to be some disc jockey slinging the same dozen shit songs day in and day out, it was a good way to get an in to the business. A great in, actually. I was lucky to have it, all thanks to my uncle. Things were fine to start. I settled in nicely. I made a few friends, got to spend hours fundraising locally with the station, and I felt like I was doing great things for the community. Funny thing, isn't it? A group of strangers all live together within, say, a 10-mile radius of each other, and we're all expected to be each other's friend. Where were they when everything went to shit? So much for community then. I was on typical basic intern duties at first. When I wasn't writing the news up for the host to present each morning, I would be running errands. Most of the time the host would want coffee or lunch or to let their dogs out. That's fine, it was easy work and I didn't mind getting to spend some time with a few furry friends now and then. It was a nice break from the monotonous computer screens and microphones that I stared at day in and day out. However, one day our boss, Victor, stopped in. He said to me seemingly out of nowhere, "Garrett, you've really been an asset to this team. I think we can all agree. So, I want you to be on our late night show with me." His voice ruptured from his throat the likes of how cockroaches explode when you stomp on them. It oozed out, slimy and rotten. See, our boss Victor was an odd fellow, an exceptionally odd fellow. He worked for the station for many, many years, slowly and surely working his way up. He never stopped by, more than likely due to the fact that he worked the graveyard shift each night. He ran a talk show. Mostly it was callers who'd call in to talk about anything and everything, ranging from lonely truckers out on the road for countless hours, just needing a voice to hear to remind them they're still in this hellish mortal coil, or even spouses who call to vent their marital problems. You name the weirdo and you've got them on air. Victor, while here this afternoon, decided he was going to change up the formula for his nighttime show. See, he had recently become infatuated with this show that would play at night called Coast to Coast, some gaudy talk show that preyed upon those of weak mind, spouting conspiracy theories and paranormal jargon at anyone daft enough to listen. Well, Victor's new idea was to take the station in that direction. Who knows if he got any permission from the parent company who owned us, but I doubt it highly. The Witching Hour, he was to call it, as if the name were to invoke some emotional response anytime he uttered the words, that cockroach ooze of a voice still slipping out between his teeth. I was to be the co-host, me, some 22-year-old dude who had never been on air before in his life, landed an internship because his uncle had ties with one of the morning show hosts. That same dude that gratefully accepted the chance that Victor had presented him. The same dude who had been promoted from a salary-free intern to someone with a decent living. The same dude who had no fucking clue what he had just got himself into. Garrett, the radio host. The transition to working the graveyard shift with Victor was not only hard on my body, as I had never worked a night shift in my small and pedantic life, but it was also extremely eerie. I was used to the office being bright in the morning, laughter from the many employees, the smells of fast food breakfast sandwiches and cheap coffee emanating through the air. Instead, I was treated to minimal lighting, so minimal I stumbled over countless things making my way to the broadcasting room, the only source of light in the entire damn studio. Victor sat there, in his chair, preparing himself for the evening show. It wasn't much. He just sat with his eyes closed, completely motionless. I never took Vic to be Buddhist. Meditation didn't seem like his thing. Now I realize, however, I didn't know much about anything. I walked into the room, as quiet as I could be to not disturb Vic. Anxiety and nerves coursed through my body like a prized greyhound. Not only was this to be the first live broadcast I'd ever done, it was with not only mine, but everyone's boss. "Welcome, Garrett. Please take a seat. Are you excited to begin?" That damned voice. I don't think I will ever get it out of my head. I took my seat, across the desk from Victor. He sat motionless, like a marionette with no master to pull the strings. "I brought you a coffee. I wasn't sure how you took your coffee, so I just defaulted to 2 creams, 2 sugar." Victor didn't reply. An ugly amount of time had passed before he spoke out of the blue. "Thank you, Garrett." He proceeded to make no motion for the coffee I was holding out for him. I could see his eyes flittering about behind his eyelids, like some sort of robot scanning the pages of a 1,000-page novel. As if nothing had happened out of the ordinary, Victor snapped out of whatever state he was in and shot me a smile. At the time I figured it to be an embarrassed smile, a sorry for holding everything up sort of smile. I know now that I was wrong. The first night went off without a hitch. The regulars all called in. Nothing strange, just lonely people calling one of the last shows on the air in the country. I felt like I had a decent presence in the show and was able to toss in a few improvised quips, keeping the calls from getting overly sappy or melancholic. Dare I say I enjoyed it. Victor was actually a fun personality to bounce off of on air. He was witty and fast with his responses. He gave some great tips to people in need, and he kept the show running on track like he had done in this for 40 years. Then, as the weeks went on and we settled into our groove, that being I show up, Victor is in some meditative state. I prepare myself, and the show goes off without a hitch. It worked well for us, and me being someone who wanted nothing more in life than to be a full-time creative, wasn't going to complain about the awkward half-hour of silence I endured sitting across from Vic every night before the show. Sure, it creeped me out, but I just sucked it up and rolled with it. Then, after a few weeks of the show going great, it dwindled. Slowly, callers stopped calling. No one cared about the show. It just died. Victor had called a meeting the next day to talk about the station's performance. It felt like any typical staff meeting. Victor would spout some hyperbolic bullshit about how we are all a team and need to band together to keep the station afloat, even if it meant some people had to pull overtime shifts to make sure loose ends were tied up in neat little bows. He then turned his attention to me. "Garrett, our show is dying. Listenership has been on a steady decline since we started. You have any ideas to bolster this?" He threw me on the spot. I had no idea what to say, so I just said, I can try and have a few of my friends call in and spark a conversation. Maybe that will help us out and get the ball rolling." Victor didn't seem to care much for that thought. He just stared at me, motionless again, mouth agape. The room grew uneasy. I think everyone was waiting for Victor to snap and fire me on the spot. He didn't, although I wish he had now. He snapped out of his mannequin impersonation, closed his mouth, stood up straight, and again the oozing voice spewed out. "Not bad. I will make some arrangements to have some preloaded callers." He never broke eye contact with me, and I could have sworn his eyes changed for a second. This brings us to tonight, this horrible, wretched night, the one I will never get out of my mind no matter how much I try. Tonight was the last broadcast of the witching hour. It started like any other. I arrived, coffee in hand, to a dark studio. Weeks of traversing the desks and chairs in the dark had made me a master at navigating this office. I made it, once again, to the broadcast room. Vic sat there, in his motionless meditative state. But this time something was off. His eyes were open, staring down at the desk, still flittering around as if he was scanning something continuously. I walked in and took a seat at my side of the desk, put down my backpack and my coffee, and pulled out some notes and conversation ideas I had jotted down. Instead of our usual half hour of silence, Victor looked up from the desk he stared at and stared directly at me, an empty look in his eyes as though he wasn't really seeing me. "This will be our best show yet. Also, our last." His voice wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't a vote of confidence. It was a statement. Nothing more, nothing less. Before I could even reply, he shut down, back into that motionless stare. I could physically see the shift. It seemed as though the puppet master had walked away from the strings. The show, again, like always, went off without a hitch. Almost every regular had called again, making the show a bustling hive of conversation. I was so surprised. There was no announcement of this being the final broadcast, and yet everyone mentioned it. Before long, the show had seemingly come to an end. Victor was in his same usual bouncy on-air personality. He decided to take one more caller, mentioning that it was his friend. It was a man with a voice as filthy as Victor's. At first I thought it was just Victor playing a joke and wasn't actually his friend. The man talked about some out there conspiracy involving mattress stores, but halfway through his story he mentioned my name. Not just my first name, being a host of a radio show made that public knowledge. He knew my entire name. First, middle, last. I was taken aback in an instant. He kept stammering on about his story, and slowly the English that he spoke turned into gibberish, live on air. It just dissipated into some gurgling noises. The call went silent, and Victor had returned to his motionless stare. I was beyond freaked out. I didn't know if I should leave to call the cops. It sounded like someone had just choked to death on the air. I asked Victor for some help, and there was no reply. Just that cold, evil stare. I called out for the caller a few times, in hopes he would reply to me. As though he were waiting for me to act first, he began to chant some words in a dialect I had never heard before, the words thundering through the studio. I cupped my ears in pain. Victor, who had been motionless until now, began to twitch. The thundering chants continuing, making my ears ring and my thoughts disperse until I couldn't focus on anything. I sat there bound to the chair by this horrific chant, watching in agony as Victor began to shift, his skin tearing and his face deforming, that ungodly stare still fixated on me. Vic, if we can even call him that at this point, turned into this lanky, black, horrific figure that still stared at me, at my soul. The voids he had for eyes, the pits where those eyes should have been, were jittering around like they were covered in maggots. I still count my lucky stars on the shoddy equipment the studio had. The connection had cut out for a split second, rendering the chant useless for a mere moment. I was free of the shackles it had bound me in. I made a dash from my chair to the exit of the studio, tumbling over all that same shit I had conquered in my months of coming here at night. I felt the presence of that thing following me through the studio and out into the night. I ran and I ran for what seemed like hours until I reached my house. There was no sign of life anywhere in town. I screamed for help, but no one came. So much for a sense of community. I can still feel the presence of it lurking in the shadows. It's been about a half hour now, but as I write this, I see him in the trees, coldly staring at me. The voids of eyes quivering, his stance motionless. Once again, the puppet master has left the strings. I fear for what will happen when he returns. God help me. The witching hour is coming to a close.